The title of her talk is Siberian Oblastnichestvo and Vostochnoe obozrenie.
Development of 19th century Siberian identity. This actually is a small part of a 47-page chapter of a book manuscript, Imagining a Nation, Irkutsk in the Yadrinsev and Siberian Identity. So we've been talking about theory. How are you going to create identity? Well, the Oblastniki and specifically Yadrinsev had an idea. In the second decade of the 21st century, Siberia finds itself in a new position with massive new mining and logging contracts. We get to that theme here again, with companies from China. We didn't plan this. China, Germany, Japan, and the United States especially. But what is the new emotional or theoretical place for Siberian? And for us today, here, where did they start on this journey? For example, on Saturday, I believe we have a paper that will address this issue specifically, so I will stop there and say, for my part, well, this is where it started. Siberians today commonly refer to the 19th century movement of Oblastnichestvo. We'll hear this in a number, or regionalism, or what I have called nationalism, for some time as a starting place for 21st century identity. In the Tsarist 19th century, at the time of this paper, Siberia was viewed legally as well as theoretically as an outpost with separate administrative rules, separate legal structure for the original peoples, and physically isolated by vast spaces that had to be traversed by wagon, sled, or on foot until the final 5 years of the century. The Siberian political movement you've been hearing about, Oblastnichestvo, played a profound and very public role in Siberian identity discourse in the final 30 years of the 20th century. 19th. This movement, which evolved in Siberia in the 60s, and as you see before that, sought to redefine Siberia in the minds of both the ruling elite in St. Petersburg and among the peoples of Siberia. They sought to build a sense of pride in place and inclusion for all Siberians. They saw Siberia as both a part of the Russian Empire and a part of Asia, something a little different as well. In addition to defining Siberia geographically and politically in modern terms, the followers of this movement, the Oblastniki, outlined a variety of reforms and policies designed to enrich the region economically, which is a core element for them, culturally and politically. While calling for acknowledgement of Siberia's unique situations, Oblastniki sought technical and political modernization, which the entire Russian Empire was seeking. For want of time to discuss in depth the theoretical political background of the movement, I'll outline their basic goals. Essentially, the core for the Oblastniki sought political reform, which would allow for greater participation of the Siberian populace in local and regional government. In order to modernize the region, they sought improved educational opportunities, healthcare, transportation, freedom of expression, press, and religion, and not least economic opportunities. Like European nationalists of the 19th century, again something we started with, they wanted their population, which included the original nations, to understand their land of Siberia, including their physical, historical, and cultural past. Finally, they saw a bright future for Siberia. Optimists. All of these ideals and goals needed a place to be expressed. Many Oblastniki wrote about Siberia whenever and wherever they could, but venues were limited. European Russian journals had limited space for such esoteric topics. The answer was journalism based on their political ideals. The major expression of Oblastnik concepts, edited and published by one of the two core leaders of the movement, Nicholas Mikhailovich Yadrinsev, was his newspaper, Vostochnoe obozrenie, or Eastern Review, which I'll call VO to speed up things here. Founded in St. Petersburg in 1882, Yadrinsev moved it to Irkutsk in Siberia in 1888, where it was published until 1906. In its heyday, from 1888 to 1894, when Yadrinsev was publisher and editor, the paper went beyond the original issues and approaches as I've just outlined and became a city paper as well, and the city was Irkutsk. The style had been set in European Russia. Just before Yadrinsev moved the paper to Siberia in 1885, a much put upon governor of Tomsk wrote that the uncensored which is, of course, obviously untrue. The uncensored Vostochnoe obozrenie, issued in St. Petersburg, persistently instills into the minds of the local society that Siberia is a frontier country united with European Russia only by an external tie, that it must have its own course and means of interior development. Follows on. In the paper, we'll hear from him again, he was always unhappy. In the paper, Vostochnoe obozrenie, whether in St. Petersburg or Irkutsk, Siberian views and interests found a powerful and useful outlet. This outlet seriously concerned the representatives of the imperial government and had every as much impact as those who feared it claimed that it had. In fact, Yevdrentsev's paper would play a similar role to that of his hero, Count Cavour's, Italian nationalist newspaper Il Risorgimento. Yevdrintsev realized the importance of the role of publishing Oblastnichestvo scholarship and ideas to the widest audience from an early stage in his career. While still in European Russia, by 1885, the paper was sold not only in St. Petersburg and by subscription, but also directly in stores in Tomsk, Irkutsk, and Omsk. Correspondents from Barnaul, Blagoveshchensk, Omsk, Irkutsk, Tashkent, notice Tashkent, Achinsk, Tomsk, and Tobolsk, among others, made VO the best informed paper in Siberia outside of Siberia. And during times of political duress in Siberia, the best informed paper on Siberia in the Russian Empire and thus the world. The themes adopted by the paper in its 5 years in St. Petersburg were varied and indicative of the basic interests of the Siberian Oblastniki. The themes included the need for the creation of a Siberian university, encouragement of broad-based education in Siberia, immigration to Siberia, encouragement of, illumination of the evils of exile, native Siberian culture and politics, mapping of Siberian territory, and archaeology, the Siberian economy, Asian history, and Russian and Western European colonialism. Yet despite VO's avowed core justification, the dissemination of information on Siberian conditions, it also provided impressive coverage of events and issues occurring in the world. Certainly much of the coverage of outside issues and arguments dealt directly, or sometimes obliquely, with issues and arguments, with questions of interest to Siberia, whether the issue was the death penalty argument in Western Europe or coverage of elections in the United States and Great Britain. Every piece of news, no matter how subtly, could be instructive for the Russian Siberian imperial audience. As the governor of Tomsk wrote, from the outset in St. Petersburg, Vostochnoe obozrenie played an integral role in Siberian affairs. While working closely with like-minded papers in Siberia, Sibirskaya Gazeta and Sibir, I must note they both were closed by 1888. During their existence, the imperial government was not happy with that relationship. In 1886, the governor of Tomsk was again infuriated by the symbiotic relationship and manner in which these journals functioned. If information was censored in either of these journals, they would then send that information on to Yevdrintsev, who printed it again without obstacle. The governor saw these papers and intentionally giving to the daily life of Siberia the most hopelessly melancholy coloring. Nothing could be further from the truth as far as the way they viewed the world. Increasingly, the pressure created by intense scrutiny, opposite to what the governor of Tomsk said, and censorship from a variety of sources in the national capital in St. Petersburg played a role to pull Vostochnoe obozrenie out of St. Petersburg, but there was the pull to Siberia that was very, very strong. Basically, you have the desire to go back to Siberia by this Siberianist, Yevdrintsev. You have the closure, censorship by death, on the part of the other two papers, and the possibility of going to a specific place, Irkutsk, which was then the regional capital for Siberia. His arrival in Irkutsk in 1888 was immediately favorable for the intellectual climate of the town, according to an observer who, I must point out, did eventually become an editor of the paper. But there's other evidence to make this point. The first issue of Vostochnoe obozrenie in Irkutsk appeared January 1st, 1888. In many ways, it looked like other European papers still. It still carried all these articles and issues, but it began to cover local government, local Irkutsk government, the court system, printed poetry, satires, obituaries, book reviews, and advertisements in order to best cover the basic concerns of the Oblastniki. Each one of these elements consistently supported their goals, and that includes my entire list here. Obituaries as well. Whether other men might have limited declaration of their ideas to editorials, as the editor and publisher of the paper, Yadrintsov was able to imaginatively use every inch to serve his ends, including the advertisements. The location in the heart of Siberia added untold advantages while it continuing to include section on the activities within the Russian Empire, Siberian on foreign affairs. Unlike in St. Petersburg, Vostochnoe obozrenie became a city paper. Upon his arrival, Yadrintsov added a chronicle of weekly events in the city and a very informative section on the meetings of the Irkutsk City Duma. He also added recurring columns on Irkutsk theater, judicial affairs, and the local stock exchange. As a function of being on the spot, much more local detail was possible, not only for the capital, Irkutsk, but also for all of Siberia. As the regional capital, the complexity of activities now being discussed publicly helped to redefine a Siberian normal as quite sophisticated. Being in Irkutsk allowed the paper easily to access the scholarship of the finest minds in Siberia. A disproportionate number of scholars and scientists in Siberia who could write for the paper resided in Irkutsk permanently, at one time, or as part of their time. To the Oblastniki, every problem faced by Siberia could be approached more readily, logically, and thoroughly if decisions and actions could be made locally, and that decision makers could be made accountable for their actions. The presence of the paper and its founder in Irkutsk presented Yadrintsov with personal day-to-day access to local government and activity. Scrutiny from Vostochnoe obozrenie helped to move towards the goal of accountability. Increasingly, Irkutsk government activity filled the pages, went from the column to filling the pages. Consistent coverage of Irkutsk city government was not one long complaint, as purported by the governor of Tomsk. So what are the topics that they handled? For intellectuals since the 18th century, support for all levels of educational reform, a major pillar of civil society, and economic involvement were encouraged. Oblastnik thought, and not surprisingly that of Yadrintsov, had been especially interested in the building of a Siberian university, and actually lobbied for its creation from the 1860s. Support for a local university did not arrive from a rejection of the outside world, but rather from the need to bring more of the outside world to Siberia. Thus, the establishment of Tomsk University just prior to the arrival of VO in Irkutsk thrilled Yadrintsov. He had actually lectured and written on the subject. Once the university was created, this is how it worked, how the system worked, Yadrintsov's paper repeatedly informed the Siberian public of what gains had accrued with the creation of the institution by covering conferences, scientific work, and such being done there. Speaking of scientific work, the Oblastniki also understood the value of scientific studies of Siberia and the need to disseminate that information to the public. So you've got this twofold, yes, scientific work's important, and everyone should know about it. This is part of know your region attitude. The education of all Siberians, and this is important here, on the physical structures of their homeland was aided by the publication of scientific work and publicity for those who labored in the field, while the Russian Geographic Society, another institution of great importance in town, for the Eastern Siberian branch, but there are other branches, had their own internal newsletters and publications. Vostochnoe obozrenie broadened the public's knowledge of Siberian scientific groups and their work by reporting on free meetings, demonstrations, what the scholarship was and what was going on. In addition to the presence of scientific organizations and their organs, Vostochnoe obozrenie, as a printer, was able to print some material that the scientific organizations could not have afforded to print themselves. And it did not limit itself to the Irkutsk Vostochnoe Sibirsky Отдел, but branched out to the others as well. Well, one other major issue for people in the regions in Siberia have obviously transportation. Transportation enhancements in general and the building of a railroad specifically were of special interest to the Oblastniki. In fact, improved transportation would serve a number of elements in Siberian life. The obvious advantage to the Siberian economy was only part of the reason for support for the development of existing and new transportation venues. In addition, enhanced transportation would serve to aid educational, health, and cultural development. To the end of encouraging, you know what's going to come here. I'm going to get to the railroad. To the end of encouraging improvement of transportation in Siberia until 1890, the paper published dozens of articles on the need of opening up Siberia through better transportation. Once a Siberian Railroad Committee began meeting, the coverage turned to critical analysis of the planning process. So perhaps the governor of Tomsk had a point. We now go from the iron rails to the sublime. The paper never lost sight of the importance of local culture. The role of poetry in Vostochnoe obozrenie was so noticeable as to warrant separate coverage. Poets and poetry had played an important role in the paper from its beginning. Living Siberian poets found a home in the paper, if you look at a number of their topics focused on the physical beauty and variety of the region, as well as what they called Siberian patriotism. One section of the paper that would cover what you should read, especially encompassed most of the core interests and goals of the Oblastniki. From the drive for literacy, increased knowledge in general, and knowledge of Siberian specifically, and encouragement of and support for the Siberian economy, all these issues could be engaged through a book review section. Reviews of novels, reports of scholarly and scientific work done on Siberia, as well as nonfiction analysis of history of pertinent political issues, both Russian and foreign, constituted the core of works reviewed. Reviews of fiction shared the pages with reviews of nonfiction. As educated people of the second half of the 19th century, the Oblastniki loved literature and sought to hold it to the highest standards. In fact, the literary criticism done at the paper has been judged in the 20th and 21st century as some of the finest work being done in Russia in the 19th century. In accordance with the Oblastnik interest in the original Siberians, the paper kept abreast of issues pertinent to their lives and history. While the paper covered contemporary political and economic issues involving the Siberians, it sought to illuminate the cultural heritage as well. Thus, when scholars such as Matvei Kangelov wrote what would be classic studies of Buryat culture, readers were informed through book reviews to buy these books, or at least to what to look for in the growing numbers of libraries, public libraries, which they also told everyone about. Obituaries. Even obituaries served Oblastnik goals. Obituaries of politically active Siberians, writers on Siberias, and teachers were singled out for the black box in Vostochnoe obozrenie. These didactic lives of secular saints, obituaries, were formats understood by a largely Russian Orthodox population. The obituary column finally served to thank and identify the many faithful authors who could not have been identified during their lifetime for their work for the paper and for the Oblastnik movement. Let's save time, I'll skip all that. I've got more on that. Advertising, last but not least. Advertising, Yadrintsev put the budding advertising industry to work supporting Vostochnoe obozrenie in the last pages of the paper. From 1888 to 1894, in issues averaging from 16 to 24 pages per week in total, from the rare 12-page issue to the 20-page, advertising filled from 1 to 5 pages, depending upon the length of the newspaper. By the 1890s, the paper was no longer limited to advertisements for Siberian books and Siberian journals. Yet advertising does not seem merely to serve a financial end to support the paper. These choices clearly sought to encourage the cultural life and economy of Siberia, disseminate information concerning the region, and improve the health and education of Siberians. So how did lowly advertising accomplish so much? The most blatant support of Oblastnichestvo came in the form of advertisements for books on Siberia, so they're still doing that. And for one of the supporters, Peter Makushin of Tomsk, who commonly advertised. As part of the city role the paper played, ads for houses and horses for sale, medical and dental doctors, stores in Irkutsk, and even the clothing required for students at a new technical school dotted the advertisement pages. By 1890, local stores were announcing their existence through the paper. However local these ads might have been, again, by no means were these pages parochial. A plethora of products from Europe and European Russia were available to the shopper through stores in downtown Irkutsk, from perfume, musical instruments, bicycles, to Polish, German, and French health products sold through the stores in Irkutsk, to an increasingly sophisticated ads by wine merchants. Even Karl Fabergé placed an ad in Vostochnoe obozrenie in 1893. As ads sought to encourage the economic growth as well as to make a case for the importance and complexity of the existing Siberian society. So, what did this all mean? The paper's profound influence on the reading public of Siberia lasted clearly until the Russian Civil War, and in fact to this day, just from statements made to me alone, but there's more out on this. From its arrival, despite censorship threats, deaths of important contributors, and internal political battles, Vostochnoe obozrenie flourished. It grew in size, averaging from 8 pages in the 1880s to 24 pages by 1893. Its expansion of sections to include Irkutsk Weekly Chronicle, coverage of the Irkutsk City Duma, theater, and detailed and immediate coverage of the activities of the Russian Geographic Society branches, all added to its increasing value to the movement, to Siberia, and to Irkutsk as a city paper. To Irkutsk, Vostochnoe obozrenie became the type of city paper that you want today, but we're not do not have necessarily. Irkutsk's concentration of homegrown, educated, and civically active scholars, scientists, merchants, and professionals created rich soil for all of the other elements that were necessary for the paper to serve Siberia so well. The concentration of administration, education, entrepreneurship, and the upper levels of the Russian Orthodox Church in Siberia, in Irkutsk, made Irkutsk the logical choice for the establishment of a paper, and in turn served to make the city even more appealing to those seeking rich cultural soil. The presence of Vostochnoe obozrenie in Irkutsk made the town even more appealing to exiles and those who might have gone home afterwards. Well, how do we know how it was viewed at the time? Well, sadly, Yadrintsev died on his way back to European Russia in 1894, and that's how we know how people felt in 1894. His unexpected death provides us with immediate insight into the role the paper was playing in the mid-1890s. Evidence from numerous telegrams, I've held piles of these, and formal memorials throughout Siberia that lasted for years, were testaments to Yadrintsev's role as a Siberian patriot, which was the term for him, for the role of the paper, and how the paper had told so many people these very touching stories of what they learned from the paper about Siberia and why they should value their homeland of Siberia. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker is Molly O'Neill, who received her PhD at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced and International Studies in 2012, having first had a rewarding diplomatic career. After teaching for several years at American University, she is now a visiting scholar at SAIS. Her book, Democracy, Civic Culture, and Small Business in Russia's Regions, Social Processes in Comparative Historical Perspective, is forthcoming. The title of her presentation is Identity Shaping Local Histories for Contemporary Russian Entrepreneurs, Evidence from 5 Regional Cities.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be using a PowerPoint. So there's the title of the presentation. Just a little bit of truth in advertising. I decided, based on reflecting on this, to limit my comparison in this presentation to only 3 of the 5 cities that are in the broader project. The broader project cities are Rostov, Samara, Tolyatti, Perm, and Smolensk. And here I'm going to restrict myself to Rostov, Samara, and Tolyatti. The broader project is just as was just read out. What this is a book which will be appearing from Routledge later this year. It's a political science approach to the problem, and it involves, in the first instance, a statistical analysis using all of the Russian federal subjects in the contemporary period as cases, and based on that analysis, drawing 4 case studies from the according to a certain logic, which I'll talk about a little bit more. The principal variables in the quantitative analysis are something I'm calling small firm prevalence, which means the numbers of incorporated small firms in a given region scaled to 1,000 people in the economically active population in different years in the period 1991 to around 2010. The other principal variable is something called a regional democracy index, which is composed of 10 sub-indicators. This is an index which was designed and conducted in 3 separate periods by a number of Russian scholars who follow regional politics and society, led by Nikolai Petrov of the Carnegie office in Moscow, formerly, now not there. Anyway. In the two cases, Samara and Rostov, are both in the spirit of this conference. I see them as somewhat distant or centrifugal, if you like, relative to the dominant political culture, and that's the basis of some of the interest of the study, but also that they are centrifugal or distant, not in the same way, but in very distinctive ways from each other. This is shows you the map of the regions. Show up as the 4 case study regions show up in a shaded color, hopefully for you. Anyway, they're the Perm region, Smolensk region, Samara region, Rostov region. Okay, how did I sort of an overview of the regions, basically cutting them, cross-tabulating them on the 2 principal variables. We see that Samara, we see that there generally is a high correlation between high performance on the numbers of small enterprises, small incorporated enterprises in the region relative to population, and the high performance on the democracy index, and also there's a tendency for low performance in both there to be association with low performance on both of those variables. But we also see that there are cross cases. And so the cases I studied shows for the book are one each from the 4 quadrants. Samara being a region which overperforms, Smolensk being one that underperforms, and Perm and Rostov being cross cases or puzzling cases for the sake of the analysis. This regression line shows exactly the same thing. I just like to show that Samara and Rostov, you can see there, are comparable on their performance on small business, small firms, but are very, very different on the rating on the democracy index. This is a sort of a model which may look very confusing, but basically this research is to look at change through time, and in that sense, I hope you'll join me in at least my claim that this is a sort of a contemporary historical look. The impulse which begins this process that's traced here is the democratic opening of the politics in the regions in 1991 and going on through the first up until around 2000. Small firms are seen as a result of this opening in the first phase. Then we have something called civic business, which I consider to be a subset of small firms, but which is not all small firms, but those who are organized in interest groups and business associations articulating the interests of the improved investment climate and things of that nature. I argue that these are conditioned by, at least my perception based on the case studies, was that the extent of this civic business community is in some sense conditioned by the awareness of business people of their own distinctive political culture and distance from the center in ideational terms. So it's a matter of the accessibility and or contestedness of the distinctive regional usable past. Civic business, therefore, you see there's an arrow that goes back from civic business to continue to nourish a process of democratization. The four areas in the democracy index, the four sub-indicators in the democracy index that seem to be influenced by the extent of small business development in a region are four. They're openness, which deals with the extent to which policies are deliberated in public, like including in public hearings and things of that nature. And that's related also to the media, which we just heard about in the case of a historical example, but wherein the public is aware of debates through an independent and diverse media environment in the regions. Civil society development in general, business associations being a key element of that. And finally, the dispersion of political authority, which means the role played by legislators at the regional level, mayors at the municipal level, and legislatures at the municipal level in diminishing the tendency for regional governors and administrations to dominate regional politics and regional decision making. And you can see that both the process that we've enumerated at the top of the model is influenced by structural and ideational antecedent conditions. And here I'm talking about, in the case of structural, I'm talking about issues such as human and physical geography, resource endowments, levels of education, and so on, diversity, ethnic diversity, or the lack thereof, and ideational antecedents involve this phenomenon of awareness of the pre-revolutionary civic life in a given region. So this is just quickly the performance of Samara and Rostov regions on the democracy index in the period 2005-2009. It should be self-evident that the result is on most of the measures. Rostov is not as viewed as democratic as being as democratic as the Samara region. This is the Rostov and Samara regions compared on the other variable, which is the small firm prevalence variable. We just see that the Samara had, they both started out comparably, but in the ensuing period, the growth of numbers of small incorporated business is much greater in Samara than in Rostov, although Rostov is higher than average, better than the national average. It's not really a national average, it's an average of all regions on that statistic. Here, though, we look at something called performance of independent entrepreneurs. An independent entrepreneur is a sole proprietorship, a business. It's a sole proprietorship, so it's not incorporated. And we can see that in this sense, if we look at entrepreneurship encompassing this sense, then clearly Rostov is a high performer. And generally, I would say in Russia, it's perceived that Rostov region is a region with a big tradition of entrepreneurship, but it tends to take a special expression in this sort of semi-formal sphere here in the independent entrepreneurs. This is a chart showing a poll of business owners in 2007-2008, indicating that those answering the poll in Rostov had a much stronger sense of obstacles to their business coming from corruption and from unfair competition, while Samara respondents tended to think of their obstacles to their business being more in the strictly economic sphere, such as being able to sell anything or find good staff and things like that. So that's a difference which is perhaps indicative of some of the trends we're looking at. I'm sorry, I skipped over this. But this just basically is the same kind of as the model we saw before. We have the democratic impulse and the structural antecedent conditions together generating certain numbers of small firms, and then small firm prevalence related to civic memory, resulting in greater or lesser relative size of the civic business community relative to the whole business community. And that is what I'm arguing has nourishes at least some continual persistence of some democratic gains from the earlier period. Okay, this is the two towering figures of regional politics in the two regions, Samara and Rostov. So Konstantin Titov in Okay, yeah, so you can see that in 1991 already the vote for Yeltsin for president indicates already a bigger disposition in Samara toward reform, democratization, market reform, and so on. But both Titov and Chub were appointed by Yeltsin, but they faced their first election in both of them in 1996, both of them won with about the same margin. But we can see by 2000 the difference that had emerged, and there are other kinds of indicators you can look at that will show you the difference. But basically, maybe it's important to just see that Chub, by the time 2000 rolled around, had definitely a much more uncontested position as governor than Titov did. Titov was still had faced rivals. One of the important rival of Titov, probably most important, although there were others, is Viktor Tarhov, who served as Samara mayor from 2006 to 2010 under the Just Russia party identification. He was defeated, but he contended in a contested election in 2010. The only close parallel to that in the Rostov region is Yuri Pogrебchikov, who was the mayor briefly in the very early 90s of Rostov, and ran afoul of Chub and resigned, and has been living in the U.S. now ever since the mid-90s. He is still, though, closely associated with the business community and business associations in Rostov, including the Regional Chamber of Commerce and a discussion club, a debate club called Club 2015 that unites quite a lot of the prominent business people of Rostov in the Rostov region. So one of the major differences between Samara and, the Samara Oblast and the Rostov Oblast was the importance of contested municipal politics and the scope of authority of mayors in Samara and Tolyatti compared to the case in Rostov. These are the mayors of Samara and Tolyatti. It's interesting to see that even in this very recent period, where, as we all know, the United Russia monopoly in elections, or near monopoly in elections, is very pervasive, that Sergei Andreev was elected mayor of Tolyatti in 2012 from the party's civic platform. So Tarhov was succeeded by a United Russia mayor, Azarov. So, for the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to move into, I hope, something that's interesting to you all. It's very interesting to me, and I have a lot to learn from you all, and that's about history and imagery and awareness of the past in these cities and how this may help to explain, sort of, or at least make manifest some of the differing political culture. So, this is a monument erected in 2009 in the downtown, in the main street of downtown Rostov. It's commemorating the founding of the Don Fortress, which is the heart of Rostov, historic Rostov in 1749. This monument suggests the foundation of Rostov as a city, or at least Rostov Fortress, is very much a deliberate projection of the power of the state, of the imperial ambition. And it also, I think, evokes a contrast which is very interesting in the political culture of Rostov, which is a contrast between, represented by Cossacks of a sort of martial, valorous kind of military ethos, and a commercial ethos, because one of the other figures there is the first director of the Don Customs Point that managed the very important trade in the Black Sea area between Rostov and partners, especially the Ottoman Turks. Okay. Also, it's worth noting that here, although it's not depicted in this, but there's a very obviously a strong awareness in Rostov of the role played by Cossacks in the conservative traditionalist white forces in the Civil War. Okay, by contrast to that then, the development of Samara I've taken this passage here, basically from a book by Orlando Fay, about the settlement of the Samara and Volga region. And the main point is Samara, founded in 1518, seems to be, the settlement of the whole region seems to be more a result of some kind of a general unguided, sort of spontaneous settlement. And also very important roles played by the role of by the people seeking refuge, either old believers, fugitive serfs, and so on. I also would contrast in physical geography. I think it's important to note the Volga operating more as an artery for internal trade, domestic trade within Russia, and where Don River is more related to trade internationally in the Black Sea region, as we said before. So, perhaps analogous to the monument in Rostov, I chose this Borlaki. When I spent time in Samara and in Tolyatti, numerous people often make reference to this as depicting something about the regional identity. Of course, this painting by Ripken, of course, I take it to be, first of all, the centrality of trade on the Volga and the grain trade in particular, but also some kind of social equality or resilience, determination, and so on. So that's my sense. Okay, business associations that I worked with and studied, well, they were in these two regions. And basically the only point I'll make here, because of the desire to get through with this quickly, is that there was quite a distinction between the style of interaction and the Rostov Business Association milieu and that of the Samara Business Association milieu. One aspect of it was the fact that the Samara region featured strong business associations focused on the municipalities of Samara and Tolyatti, whereas in Rostov everything was dominated by the regional or oblast Chamber of Commerce. So the interactions in Samara seem to be more public and more inclusive than in Rostov. In Rostov, interactions with the regional administration on the part of the business association, especially the chamber, tended to have a more sort of expert, advisory, consultative type of flavor. So a different kind of context and a different style of interaction. This is the chairman of chairman of the board now and founder of the Tolyatti Chamber, which was an outstanding example of, for me at least, of a chamber which had actually quite a bit of activity in the civic sphere and with NGOs and so on. I'll go on past it though because time is now short. This is, by contrast, and again, I'm not trying to diss Rostov. It's also extremely interesting place, and there's a lot of economic success. The head of the chamber there, Nikolai Prizhyaznyuk, is himself a former mayor of Novocherkassk, and has been very effective in his role of leading the chamber now for some years. He's the one on the right. This is a picture of him recently receiving an award from the governor for the chamber's extension of charitable assistance and other kinds of aid to the refugees settling from eastern Ukraine, as you might guess. That would be an important issue. Okay, so here I'm just now going to look at just some kind of aspects of preservation or destruction that seem to me to be indicative also of the important contrast in civic memory in the places that we looked at, the cities we looked at. This is the very interesting monument erected in Tolyatti to the founder of Stavropol on the Volga, which is the city which preceded Tolyatti. I don't know if you're all aware of this, but maybe you all are. But Tolyatti, the preceding city, Stavropol, was flooded in order to make a hydroelectric station. And so this is what remains. The city is there underneath the surface. This initiative of putting this monument came from the first elected mayor of Tolyatti, Sergei Zhilkin. And I believe that it must be, to me at least, it's quite obvious that it's at least an ambivalence, if not a repudiation, of the decision made to build the industrial plant there. of course, the result of that industrial plant is the major industrial asset of the whole Samara region, which is Avtovaz, the auto company. This is a now majority owned by Renault Nissan, by the way. This is also a monument that sort of dare not speak its name, I guess. This is a national hotel, and it still stands in downtown Samara. It's run by the Azimut chain. But as I read about the history of the region and talked to people in Samara, I realized it also had a role in the persistence of the civic memory. This is closely associated with the anti-Bolshevik administration, Komuch, which was based in Samara in 1918. The head of the administration, Komuch, was a native of the Samara region who had been elected chairman of a constituent assembly in 1918. And when it was dissolved, he came there, founded a short-lived administration, and there, at its height, it had about 100 members of a constituent assembly, many of whom had been from the SR party. The Chamber of Commerce of Samara region actually cites in its website that it was founded under the administration of Komuch. So I think that's kind of an interesting survival of that past brief episode. It may have something to do with the political culture of Samara. This is a contrast between Rostov and Samara. On this square in Samara, this was the square where once stood the, must have been very huge and impressive Orthodox cathedral, and it was demolished to put in this Kubyshev memorial and the opera, theater, and ballet, I think, there. So this is a contrast to Rostov, which I think a puzzle for me was, why is the city of Rostov spared so much? Why is there so much of the pre-revolutionary architecture? In particular, this principal cathedral stands in the middle of the city and is surrounded by market stalls and so on. It's quite a lively place, certainly by contrast to what we just saw in Samara. And then finally, I'll bring up the Armenians because I think it's very interesting. And it may help to explain some of the special disposition to commerce that you can find in Rostov, despite the also contending tradition of the Cossacks. And that is that Rostov is actually, modern Rostov is actually a fusion of historical Rostov and another city which was called Nakhichevan, which was founded by resettled Armenians, brought from Crimea, resettled from Crimea in the 18th century. It's very interesting in the biographies of both the Governor Chub and the former Mayor Pogrebshikov, this region of the city, it's a district of the city, it's now called Politarskaya, oddly enough. It's full of these wonderful old graceful homes, many of which are in buildings, and many of which have been restored very nicely, and is still identifiably an Armenian quarter of the city. So, in closing, there's another picture. These are my own photos, so maybe not that great, but very, very attractive area. So in closing, I just find that, I just would say that you probably have gathered that the Samara case basically conforms in a very regular way to this anticipated causal chain that I developed in the case studies and with reference to the regression evidence. But the Rostov case is much more puzzling because the contradictory elements of both the structural disposition to trade and the civic memory, most of which dominated by what might be seen as not necessarily such a favorable disposition to business in the civic sphere, at least, or transparent and formal kind of legal arrangements for the conduct of business. So I could elaborate more, but I think you can probably see the point. So thank you very much.
Jane Koslow at Bates College, and this is a question for Molly. First of all, I love that notion of civic memory and the way you're kind of talking about it, and it seems really productive for thinking about the way in which built environments and local cultures and local storytelling and more official forms all kind of interact in a really interesting and maybe hard to get at way, but I really love that. It seemed very suggestive. I actually have a question about the picture you showed of your, I think they were the mayoral challengers. So you're trying to think about, it seemed to me you were trying to think about cultural messages that are embedded in some of what you're looking at. And is that, you said you were looking for some input from humanities people. And so I wondered if you could interpret that picture a little bit, the one on the left. Because it seems to me that this mayoral, I mean, for one thing, it's a very spontaneous picture. Was it a picture that was taken for a public venue? Because he's sitting among a bunch of really interesting, culturally laden signs. And so the other images that you've used are very, very official kind of publicity shots that say next to nothing about ethnic or cultural or religious identity. But that one says a lot. And so I'd wondered if you might reflect a little bit. And also, who was the audience for it?
Well, I think this photo is probably taken after Tarhoff was defeated from the mayor's post in the after that 2010. I may be wrong, but basically, I guess I didn't think about it as bespeaking anything other than anything at all, except that I think that when you look at it, it suggests a level of well, I mean, one of the things that characterized my interactions in Samara and Togliatti even more so, was, you know, a certain level of informality and welcoming, you know, personal rapport and things like that. So I guess what it may mean is Victor Tarhoff isn't fussed about what he looks like in a photograph or, you know, in a newspaper. I think it appeared in a Samara newspaper. It's sort of a profile. In fact, now that I remember it, is something like, oh, well, what now are you going to do? You know, you're not the mayor or something like that. So anyway. Yeah. I didn't mention about his history, but he had been, he actually was for a brief time, you know, in the Soviet period, he was like a enterprise director, and in the 90s, he was for a while a vice president of Newcomb. Samara had a very fully integrated sort of business space with the nationally prominent companies, and Yukos was there, and he was associated with it and may have had support from them in that early stage. So he's probably kind of well-traveled or something like that. It may just be souvenirs or something. Yeah.
I have time for only one more question. So.
Thank you for the
Okay. I had a quick question for Helen. I'm struck by what you were saying about the obituaries that appeared in the newspapers, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about them. I was thinking, were they just hagiographical kind of celebrations, or was there something more going on in discursive terms? Were they trying to establish relationships, generational relationships, yes, ideas of a legacy, a human legacy and heritage, which was being followed on from? Could you say a bit more about that?
There were anniversary obituaries. You didn't have to have just died recently. You could have died earlier, years before. And you wouldn't have had an obituary. They didn't have the newspaper. And of course, who gets chosen for these obituaries? People who were doing things. They weren't Oblastniki because it was earlier time. They were doing things to help define Siberia. They worked on the writing of dictionaries, of covering local Asian Siberian culture. There actually was an obituary for Mazhov, if you've used his bibliography. So you didn't actually have to be a Siberian or have ever been in Siberia necessarily. His bibliography, when he died, there was quite a great coverage, and it provided people a chance to, the paper to point out what wonderful work someone had done and how it was in some way connected to developing Siberian identity. So yeah, they were very conscious. And for those people who had written for Vostochnoe, obozrenie, and whose initials, there was a lot of that. Figuring out who wrote articles sometimes is in itself a full-time, lifetime work. But they get identified when they die. I have you haven't seen it, the full thing. I've got the entire run on microfilm, which explains these. And so it's a matter of going through and just plowing through. That's why all the page numbers, all that, I've just sat and counted all it. It's just fascinating how he made the case. And of course, his hero, the picture in his office was Count Cavour, Il Risorgimento, which says all sorts of things for political development, nationalism, and such, and what newspapers could do.